And the one about the harvest last week, remember, was that God promises there will be a harvest, and it will be abundant. Now, that story was told because of all of the opposition that the disciples were experiencing for their ministry and what Jesus was trying to do. That opposition continues in the gospel, and so Jesus has another story about God. Not about us, that we should be good seeds in the field or good wheat in the field, or not that we should plant good seed or anything that we should do, remember. Remember, the gospel is not demands, but promises. And so Jesus is telling a story about a promise of God in this wheat and weeds story. As he talked to the crowds, primarily concerned with the attitudes of his religious leaders, they would understand this image of the wheat field. They would understand that Jesus was using this image to talk about the family of God, the people that were God's people, are God's field, and he has planted good seed. And the Pharisees then would assume that they were part of this wheat, this good wheat that had grown up in the field. They would also understand that there were some weeds in the field. And for the Pharisees, the good wheat were the people who understood the law and who did everything they possibly could to keep all of the rules. That was the good wheat. Anybody else was the weeds. And they assumed, of course, that this concept was how God looked at his field and saw the wheat and the weeds. So they would associate with the slaves of the master who come to the master and say, "Where'd these weeds come from?" And he says, "Well, an enemy has planted them." And so the slaves say, "Do you want us to pull out the weeds?" The Pharisees would associate with that. Then suddenly Jesus says, the master says, "No." And he tells them a story about the mystery of the patience of God. Because the master says, "No, just let the weeds and the wheat grow together." Now the Pharisees would get caught up in this one right away. There's no way in the world that they expected Jesus to say, "Let the weeds grow with them, the wheat." And so what is this? What's going on here, they would say. That's not the way we expected God to handle his people, the wheat, and those people that they rejected and looked down on because they were the weeds. Because Jesus constantly seemed to be including the weedy people with the good people. He was always criticized, remember, from associating with tax collectors and sinners. And the religious leaders were constantly frustrated and upset with him because he, in this parable sense, included the weeds with the wheat. So Jesus tells this story and he says, God, the Master, says patience. Just let these things grow together. And the Pharisees would have to say, why in the world would God say that? Jesus says there are a couple of reasons in the story. Number one is that it's really hard to separate the weeds and the wheat. Now Jesus would say this because in his story, the people were thinking about a weed called darnel. And in Jesus' time, the darnel weed started growing, and in its beginning growth phase looked very much like a growing wheat plant. And so it would be, as the two were growing together, it would be very difficult to separate the two, to make sure that you didn't pull out something good when you pulled out something you thought was bad. In other words, maybe know the life story of someone who starts out a terrible kind of life and eventually through the years has some sort of a deathbed conversion and turns out not to be a weed, but good wheat. Or it may be that someone starts out good and then falls away, starts out with what looks like being the good wheat and turns out to be a weed. And it takes a long time to figure out what's going to happen to the weeds and the wheat, Jesus says. Don't be impatient with judging who's wheat and who's a weed. Secondly, when it's hard to tell the difference, secondly, Jesus says you're kind of out of your class when it comes to trying to judge good and evil. It's kind of, in our sense, as if you or I would be asked to judge, say, Olympic high jumps. How would we be equipped to judge Olympic high jumpers in their form? And obviously if they knock down the bar, okay. But maybe a better analogy would be to judge the freestyle in the Olympic gymnastics. How would we judge whether a flip was better than this one's flip? You know, we're just not equipped to do that. Jesus says, you're not equipped to judge weeds and wheat yet. Because, he says, think about my lifetime and the things that I did. And so the Pharisees would have to think about Jesus. And they would remember that Jesus was most judgmental on the religious leaders. You know, we don't have many stories about Jesus being judgmental against the weeds. We have Jesus going to Jericho and he sees Zacchaeus in the tree, the tax collector, who's cheated all kinds of people so that he can make money. And he says to Zacchaeus, come down, I'm coming to your house. I'm going to have dinner with you. Jesus is invited to the house of a Pharisee for dinner. And this woman comes in from the street and wets Jesus' feet with her tears and wipes them with her hair. And the Pharisee says if Jesus knew what kind of a woman this was, he wouldn't have accepted her. And Jesus says, Simon, she has loved much, and so she is forgiven much. The one who loves little is forgiven little. And there's the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus says, you know, go tell your husband that you talked to me. And she says, I don't have a husband. And he says, no, you've lived with 7 other people, and the one you're living with now is not your husband. John says they bring this woman caught in adultery to Jesus. And they ask him, should we stone her, like Moses says? Jesus stoops down and he writes in the dirt, and then he says, let him without sin cast the first stone. Then he goes down and scribbles in the dirt again, and he looks up and nobody's there. And he says to the woman, isn't anybody here to condemn you? No, they've all left, she said. He says, I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. But Jesus called the Pharisees hypocrites. Tombs painted over with whitewash, but inside they had dead bones. He was talking to the religious leaders then. Those are the people that he judged who didn't know what God was like. And he accepted the weeds and offered them forgiveness. What do you suppose you would do if God suddenly said to you, I'm giving you the authority to root out all evil in your congregation and in your community? Where would you start? And where would you go? Because you see, the early church was recognized by those outside the church. But Luke doesn't say that that the people in Antioch recognized the Christians because of their music at worship. He doesn't say they recognized the Christians by how often they used the creation setting in the liturgy. He doesn't say they recognized the Christians because they kept all the rules. He says they recognized the Christians. Why? Look how they loved one another. That's how the people in Antioch knew who the Christians were. Not because they kept all the rules, but because they loved each other. You see, folks, that's what the church is supposed to be. The world should look at us and say, those people must be Christian. Look how they love one another. And then we get to arguing, about whose synod is right and whose is wrong, and whether, whatever we argue about. But Jesus says, you see, you're not equipped to make those kinds of judgments on who's weeds and who's wheat. Suppose that God would suddenly now come and pull out all of the weeds, all of the people who are not in His sight valid wheat. I'm not sure how secure we would feel. So it's very difficult, Jesus says, to tell the difference between the weeds and the wheat while they're growing. It's hard to see whether a person who gives a lot or gives little is a weed or wheat. It's hard to see whether a person who's really active in the church or a person who isn't active in the church is weeds or wheat. What we tend to do, of course, at times, is to act like the slaves. We want to cleanse our membership lists of all of those people that don't give or don't commune. Write them off. Take them off of the list. Pull up the weeds, throw them out. I don't know what's, the best thing to do with that situation. But I think Jesus says in this parable, the best thing is not to pull them up like weeds and throw them out. There's got to be some better way to do it. Let them grow and see if time allows those weeds to become more like wheat. So what's the promise in this story? Promise, Jesus says, is that God is still in control of the field. And you and I do not have to worry that the weeds are going to overtake the wheat. There might be times when we wonder about that. When things look so bad that we think, well, are the weeds ever going to take over? Maybe you've had a garden or a flower bed like that where the weeds just take over. Jesus says you don't have to worry about that. God's in control, and there will be a harvest of the good. Evil will be taken care of. It'll be eliminated. That's part of the promise. But the promise basically is that God will harvest the good. Like John says in his gospel, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. We hear about people dealing in futures. They deal with futures of oil, futures of soybeans. They bid a price on something that they expect oil or soybeans to bring in the future. Jesus is telling a story about God's bidding on our wheat futures, on us. That's us. We consider ourselves the good wheat in the field. God's bidding on our futures. And He says, I'm going to take you home. And all of that evil is going to be eliminated. That's the good news of that story. Not that we should be good wheat, or not that we should pull the weeds out and throw them out, but that God is going to take us home. And He's in control of the field, and He'll take the wheat, and evil will be eliminated. That's the promise. That's the gospel, the good news of the story. So Jesus says, no demands, just good news in the story. We may not know what the future holds, but we know who holds the future. Amen.